This is John Peltonen with 3Sharp. In this visual how-to video, creating business data catalog entities in SharePoint Server 2007, we're going to start from scratch and at the end of the day have a business data catalog metadata file that defines a single entity that can be exposed through our SharePoint Server 2007 site. Specifically, we'll be using the AdventureWorks database for SQL Server 2005, and we'll be exposing the customer entity as defined in the database through a business data list in SharePoint. Before we can crack open Visual Studio and start building the XML that will define our business data catalog entities, we first need to figure out what our entities are and how we're going to get them. In our case, we're using a database, and all we need to do is write the appropriate SQL query that will pull the data out of the database. In our case, it's very simple. We're going to pull the customer ID, a concatenation of last name and first name that we'll just call name, phone and email address from this view, the individual customer, that is just out of the box in the sample database for AdventureWorks for SQL Server 2005. If I execute this query, we should have, 18,508 rows returned to us. These are the customers that we want to expose in SharePoint. So as you can see, we're starting with a root level node called LOB system. We've got a few attributes. The first one is the type. We have two types of LOB systems. We can either have database or web service. So I'm going to choose database. The version info is important when I'm uploading this metadata file to SharePoint. SharePoint will let me upload versions greater than the version it currently knows about. If I'm trying to upload a metadata file that's older than the current version, it's going to kick me back and not let me. Since I haven't done anything with SharePoint yet, it doesn't matter what this is. We'll just keep it at the first. This is the name of the LOB system. I can call this whatever I want. And then the all-important namespace, the default namespace for the elements in my schema. And this, of course, just corresponds to the business data catalog schema. So now I have three top-level elements: access control lists, LOB system instances, and entities. Access control lists can also be defined through the system's administration UI, but I'm just doing it here for ease of use. I have three principals: domain admins, the current user I'm logged in as, and domain users. We have four rights: execute, which basically it can be related to read. So can I go pull in my entities? Can I administratively edit the entities? Can I set permissions on the entities? And then can I, as a user, go create a business data list web part and then select the entities from this LOB system and tell the business data list web part to show entities from this system. So these two here, the edit and the set permissions, are really administrative level. The execute and the selectable in clients is really user level permissions. Likewise, for my domain users, I'm just going to have the user level, the execute, and the selectable in clients. Now I can have these access control entries associated with my entities instead of just at the top level. For me, it's just easier to put these at the top level and just assume that they're going to apply to all my entities. Moving down to my LOB system instances element, I've got one, sales database, and this basically just tells the business data catalog in SharePoint how to access my LOB system. In my case, because it's a database, I'm just defining a query string. I'm using pass-through authentication. I'm using the SQL Server Data Access Provider. I'm accessing this server, called MOS in my case. You'll need to change this for you, and the AdventureWorks database. The key here is that I'm accessing one database. That's what I can do with a database LOB system. Now the entities. This is really the crux of the metadata file. I have one entity defined called customer. And if we look at this entity, we'll see three top-level elements that are really key to the basic functionality of my entity: my properties, identifiers, and methods. We're going to start at the bottom here and look at the methods element. We'll see we have one method defined called getCustomers. Now every method out there will have properties, parameters, and method instances. Our properties, the key to the properties is explaining how we're going to go talk to that LOB system and get the data. This should look familiar. This is the select statement that we built in SQL Management Studio earlier in the video. So we're just, again, pulling the customer ID, a concatenation of last name and first name that we're calling name, phone, and email address from this view, the individual customer view. Now I've got a where clause here. Don't pay attention to that right now. I just want to pay attention to this top level stuff, specifically this customer ID. Now, having that memorized, if we go up to our identifiers, we'll see that I have one identifier defined called customer ID. And it's not a coincidence that's named the same as this customer ID. Now the identifiers collection is the collection of fields that's coming back from my LOB system that uniquely identifies an instance of that entity. So in my case, in the case of a database, we're talking about primary keys. So for me, for a customer, it's just the customer ID. That's the only field I need to uniquely identify that entity. So all of these identifiers combined, I can have more than one, but I don't in this case. All of them must uniquely identify that field together. So in this case, that's it. That's all I can have up here, customer ID. And that's what the system uses to uniquely identify that entity. Now I have properties up here. I have one property called title, and that's what the system uses to describe the entity to the user. This is the field down here, name, that we'll use first and foremost when we're talking about that entity in context to the user. Now let's move back down into our method. So we've looked at our property. It's basically just our SQL command. What else do we have here? We have parameters and method instances. Now we have 3 parameters. And now is time to go back to our property and look at that where clause. I have 2 parameters here, min customer ID and max customer ID. And basically the where clause is saying where the customer ID is greater than or equal to the min customer ID, and customer ID is less than equal to the max customer ID. Now that does look kind of silly. I'll describe why I did that in a minute. It's shorthand. You definitely don't need to do something like this in the business data catalog. I did it to keep the XML down. So let's take a look first at our parameters. We've got 3. 2 input parameters that correspond to our parameters in our query, our min customer ID and our max. If I expand that, we're going to see first off a type descriptor. And that type descriptor is going to define this parameter for the system, for the BDC Business Data Catalog system. So first off is our type. In this case, it's our .NET data type. It's a system.in32. And this data type basically is working as a translation between what we're getting back from our LOB system and what SharePoint knows. We're giving the type descriptor a name, customer ID. Then we're also giving it an identifier name. So we're associating this parameter with the identifier. And what that means is when SharePoint is looking for a specific instance of that entity, it should call this parameter with the unique identifier for that entity. And if it does that, we'll guarantee that it will get a unique instance of that entity back. I'm just going to bump down into my next parameter here, my max customer ID, and we'll see an almost identical setup. We'll see the system.in32, we'll see the name of customer ID, and also the same identifier associated with it. So what that means is when I'm looking for a unique customer instance of this entity, I'm going to pass that ID in both this field and this field. So when customer ID is greater than or equal to 15, we'll say, and customer ID is less than or equal to 15. So that's just a shorthand for me of saying that I can get a specific customer instance from this query. Now, if I also call this with a sufficiently low customer ID and sufficiently high max customer ID, I can guarantee that I'm getting the range of all of my customers. Granted, this is kind of bad to do if you have an auto-incrementing number. How do you know how big it's ever going to get? But again, this is just kind of shorthand for me to have one method here called getCustomers that will return both unique instances and individual instances, and all instances. So now let's go down to our return parameter. So we're giving it a name, customers. We're giving it a type descriptor just like we gave our input type descriptors. This one's a little more complicated. Our type name is more complicated. Basically, it's a data reader. If I scroll over some more, we have 2 more attributes. This is a collection. What I'm telling the business data catalog here is that what this type descriptor has inside of it is a collection of entities, a collection of fields. And then I'm giving it a name, customer data reader. So if I go back and expand this type descriptor, we'll see I have a type descriptors element. I expand that and I have another type descriptor. This time it's a data record. So now what's going on here is that I've got an iData reader that's a collection of data records. And if I go in and look at what the data records described as, we'll see something that looks kind of familiar. We'll see our customer ID, we'll see our name, our phone, and our email address. So we're taking those fields that are getting pulled back in our SQL statement, and we're giving them the types in 32, string, 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 and anything else we need to give them. Like again, I'm associating the identifier with my customer ID. So I'm associating the identifier with the query parameters, with the entity itself, and with the return parameters. I'm always having to make sure that I'm telling SharePoint how to uniquely identify a given entity within the collection. I can do some other things too, like down here for email address, I can give it a localized display name. There's no space between email and address. It looks kind of ugly. It would be nice if I could put a space in just for formatting. So for those in the language ID of 1033 US English, they're lucky enough to get a space here. For those in, say, France or Germany, they're unlucky until I give a specific LCID that matches their locale and can then give a translated name. So finally, after our parameters, we have method instances. Now, method instances are really an entry point into our method from specific pieces of functionality within SharePoint. We have two types of method instances we're using here. We have a type called Finder and a type called Specific Finder. Now, a Finder method instance is used by the BDC list, and it's used to really return all instances of an entity. So that's the select statement really without the where clause, or with a where clause that's configured to return all possible entities. We have a specific finder that's used by a huge variety of things within SharePoint. It's used by search, it's used in order to have BDC actions, it's used for filtering, so it's used for a lot of different things. So these are the two kind of basic method instances that we really need to have in order to have a functioning entity. Now I'm giving them names, my customer finder instance and my customer finder specific instance. I'm giving them return parameters. So in my case, it's the customers, my one return parameter that I've defined. And I can optionally define a return type descriptor name, so that customer data reader type descriptor. This is more handy if I have a web service and I have a hierarchical, very deep type deeply typed return parameter. I can send back just a subset. Now, keeping our method instances in mind, our customer finder instance and our customer specific finder instance, I'm going to go back into my parameters and look not at the return parameter, but my input parameters. I'm going to go into just one, because it's very similar, and go down. Now note that I have some default values associated for this input parameter. And I've got default values for both method instances, the finder and the specific finder. And note that my default value is 0. So what that means specifically for my finder is that if I don't pass in a parameter, which SharePoint won't for the finder instance, my min customer ID will be 0. And I happen to know that's sufficiently small enough to be beneath my lowest customer ID in the database. Now, technically, I don't really need a method instance or a default value for my customer specific finder instance, because SharePoint will always be giving me a specific customer ID that it's looking for here. Likewise, if I look at my other input parameter, my max customer ID, I've got similar default values assigned, but this time they're just sufficiently high enough to be higher than my max customer ID. And yes, this is kind of weird, because if I have more than 99 million customers, I'm going to filter out my customers. And this is typically why for methods you would have, and let me just minimize some of these things, two methods. One called get customers and another called get specific customers. One method, the get customers method, would implement the customer finder instance. The next method, get specific customers, would implement the customer specific finder instance. This is shorthand. It keeps the XML a little shorter. It lets you kind of look at everything all together. That's why I did that. So I've tabbed over to Internet Explorer, and I'm in the Shared Services Administration section of SharePoint. I'm going to scroll down to the Business Data Catalog section and simply click on Import Application Definition. From here, I'm going to browse to the XML file that I just built in Visual Studio and go down and click Import. Now SharePoint will parse that XML file top to bottom, give me any errors that happen, and hopefully if I don't have any errors, it will tell me that importing was successful. I'll click OK, and I'll move to the Entity Management portion of SharePoint. So now I can do things like manage permissions or go down and actually view my entities and manage the entities. In my case, I'm not going to do that. It's sufficiently cool enough that I've got my entity defined in SharePoint. Now I'm going to switch over to my SharePoint site itself. I've got the SharePoint site called BDC Test defined, and I'm simply going to go in and add a Business Data List web part. So in the Add Web Parts dialog, I'll scroll down and choose the Business Data List, click Add, and then click to open the tool pane to manage the web part. Once in the tool pane, I can browse to select the specific entity I want to add. In my case, this will be customer from my sales DB. And I'll click OK. And lo and behold, here are the customers showing up from my SQL database in my list. I've got 1 through 20. I can scroll if I need to. I can get in and edit the view to show more than 20, less than 20, etc.